Yamini, you can start now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yamini Meena, and I'm a research intern at Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It gives me immense pleasure to extend to you a very warm welcome on behalf of ICS for our Wednesday seminar on local resistance to Tibetan rehabilitation Indo-Tibetan borderlands of Arunachal Pradesh. The presence of Tibetan refugees in Arunachal Pradesh has been a topic of controversy as local identity narratives prioritize indigenous communities over refugee rehabilitation. The 2014 Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy announcement was met with swift opposition from various student groups in the state. This seminar aims to explore the localized resistance to the TRP in the West Kameng and Tawang districts comprising the Monyul region. Specifically, the discussion will try to look into the resistance demonstrated towards the minuscule Tibetan population against the backdrop of exclusionary narratives of blood and soil in the Indo-Tibetan borderland. Our speaker for today is Dr. Sonika Gupta, an Associate Professor of Global Politics at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Her research interests include the Tibetan exile community in India, state-making in India's Himalayan borders, and cosmopolitanism and international relations study. The ongoing work of her research group, Tibetscapes, can be accessed via the link given in the chat box. The chair for today's seminar, Dr. Nimi Kurian, is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Her research focuses on Asian borderlands and looks in particular at the intersections between capital and ecology, federalism and foreign policy, and resources and rights. Dr. Kurian is a member of the External Advisory Board of the India-China Institute, the New School, New York, and has served on the fellowship committee of various programs and institutes. Her recent publications include India-China Borderlands, Conversations Beyond the Center, and India and China, Rethinking Borders and Security. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to remind all participants to adhere to few housekeeping rules. To ensure a smooth discussion, all participants will be muted during the seminar. Questions can be posted in the chat box throughout the presentation, or you can use the raise hand options during the Q&A session. You will be called upon to unmute yourself by the chair. That's all. I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Nimi Kurian to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Yamini, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today for the conversation. Let me also, on behalf of everyone, extend a warm welcome to our speaker today, Sonika. I think the topic she's going to speak to us today really intersects with so many critical debates, be it the politics of belonging, the discourse on rights, or as Hannah Arendt puts it, the right to have rights. And what living in liminal spaces really means, and the contestations these produce, wherein I think groups have fought at multiple fronts, be it against the state, against outside, quote unquote, outsiders, and frequently against one another. So with those words, let me welcome and request Sonika to make her presentation. Over to you, Sonika. Could you please take about 30 to 35 minutes? Would that be sufficient, or would you like?
Yes, I think that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, great. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nimi. And it's my absolute pleasure to be invited for a talk by the ICS. Well, I have heard talks at the ICS as I was a student of China and growing up and much beyond that. So for me, it's quite a privilege to be giving a talk here. And I think Dr. Nimi put this in context very well when she spoke about people living in liminal spaces, because it does quite neatly capture the fact that what I'm going to be speaking to you today is about identities that are not quite fixed in any one they're not quite fixed in any one cultural or formal space, but they have a fluidity to them, which then creates a situation in which at times they become assets and at times they become liabilities. So to sketch out a mind map of what I'm going to be talking about today in the next half an hour or so is to, let me just introduce you to my field sites first, okay? So what we are going to hear today is about this region. So Tawang and West Kameng districts, which, can you see my cursor moving? I'm wondering if you can see my cursor moving on the screen.
Yes, yes.
So within the square, these two districts, which are the westernmost districts, not just of Arunachal, but also of India, right? And this is a bigger, this is extracted out of the map. So these are the two districts and the Tibetan refugee population here that I'm going to be primarily talking about. There are, and one of the key settlements there, one of the main settlements in this area is the Tenzingao Tibetan settlement. This is also the only formal settlement of Tibetans in between these two districts. There are other scattered populations of Tibetan refugees, both in West Kameng, largely around Bomdila, and in Tawang town, in and around Tawang town. But this is the only formal settlement of Tibetans between these two districts. And there are other settlements, of course, of Tibetans in Arunachal, as you can see from this map. And to give you a chronology of these, the Tezu settlement, which you can see here, was set up in 62 and had an initial population of only about 950 people, followed by Bomdila in 65, followed up by Tenzinggang, which is what I'm talking about, in 1971, followed by Miao in 75, and Tuting, which is the latest, in 2013. So the last settlement was established about 10 years back. So this has been a process that has gone on since 1962 till about 10 years back, right? And the total population, if you look at the slide, numbers on the slide, none of these settlements have a very large population. In fact, they all tend to fall below 2,000. Tenzinggang particularly we will speak about. Now, when we talk about West Kameng and Tawang, you can see it's bordered by Bhutan in the south and Tibet all the way around otherwise, right? So this region that is the Indo-Tibetan borderland is also known as Monyul. Monyul is a historical cultural region which has existed at least since the middle of the 1600s. Predates that in its cultural exchange, in its religious institutions, but begins to take prominence in the middle of the 1600s. In 1680, the fifth Dalai Lama proclaims Monyul to be a part of Tibet. And it is also the year the construction of the Tawang monastery begins. In the same century, the Tibetan government constructs 4 fortresses, or zongs as they are called, in Monyul for the purpose of collecting tax. Dirang Zong and Takluk Zong. These are the 2 zones that you find in the present West Kameng district. You find their ruins in the present West Kameng districts. Then in 1683, the 6th Dalai Lama is born in Tawang at the Urgeling monastery, right? And if you talk about it today, Tawang and parts of West Kameng, that is Bomdila and Kalaktang and Dirang, these regions of the West Kameng district, they are Buddhist majority areas, and generally Tawang and West Kameng both are Buddhist majority districts in Arunachal. Okay, so why I am introducing something which existed so long back, what relevance does it have in today's territorialized world between what we now look at as India and China's border? Well, India's and China's borders is essentially India and Tibet's border, right? And we have to be able to contextualize what is happening on the ground today by looking at what are the circulatory forces of history with regard to materials, with regard to economy, with regard to religion, with regard to kinship groups that have operated and continue to operate in this region of Monyul. Those of you who might be familiar, there was also till about 15 years back, the existence of the Mon autonomy movement is in Tawang and these 3 regions of Dirang, Kalaktang, and Bomdila that I have mentioned. That's quite I cannot give details about that because that's a separate talk by itself. But there has been, for a very long time, a ground-up assertion to convert Monyul into a Buddhist majority or a Buddhist-dominated political area along with its cultural identity. So these things begin to take relevance in the things that we are discussing today. And historically, we also must keep in mind that though the 1940, the Simla Agreement actually put into place a border between Tibet and India, there was very little administrative enforcement of it on the ground. So till 1951, even after India's independence in 1947, regions in Monyul were actually, they continued to pay tax to monasteries as well as the government in Lhasa. So both in terms of its economy and in terms of its social organization, the region of Monyul was oriented towards Lhasa rather than south of the McMahon line. And it's in 1951 with the Kathing mission that tax paying from Monyul to Lhasa and monasteries in north of the McMahon line actually comes to a formal end. Okay. Now, there are two concepts I'm going to use in this particular talk. One is Appadurai's concept of fear of small numbers. So as Appadurai has explained, that in the era of globalization, the drive to achieve national purity necessarily creates othering categories, which then are considered to be, their identity is considered to be in opposition to the mainstream identity. Now, if you look at it in terms of globalization and large collectivities of people, or in terms of interstate relations, this might look like a very easily understood relationship between the dominant and the dominated. However, it has many layers to it. So, for example, assertions of indigeneity, especially in the area that we are talking about, begin to actually align themselves much closer to the national imagination of an Indian imagination, and they begin to then other people who they then identify as do not belonging in this region. Most of these arguments are on the basis of blood and soil, as we will see. Okay, and this is quite contradictory to what the legal framework of India with regard to citizenship has said initially. Okay, and then there is this is well documented in Appadurai's work and work that uses Appadurai's work, that there is always a statement of saying the small minority will actually overtake the majority. So if you look at West Kameng and Tawang, if you can read the chart, the total population there, and if you compare it with the total number of Tibetan refugees in this area, it's not even 1.5% of the total population. Why I've split it into rural and urban, I'll get to it in a while. Now, why it is important to pay attention to this is because there is a consistent articulation of the Tibetans taking over the interests of the local people, not belonging in the region, especially since 2014. However, to be able to understand why this anti-refugee sentiment is there against the Tibetans, we also have to understand Arunachal as a state and its history of anti-refugee sentiment that has been there at least since the 70s, much before, but politically significant since the 70s. Okay. Now, in 2014, what happens is the government of India announces what is called the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy. What exactly is the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy? It's a policy that was concluded in consultation between the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala and the Home Affairs Ministry of Government of India to resolve a set of issues with regard to Tibetan resettlement. One of these primary issues was land. So Tibetans, there are multiple Tibetan settlements in different parts of India. All of them have different land lease or land tenure arrangements. What the Tibetan Rehabilitation Policy did was to provide a standardized land lease to Tibetan settlements for 20 years from the date of commencement of the lease. This is intended to provide land tenure security to Tibetan refugees on the understanding that when they return to Tibet, that land will revert back to its original owners or the government of India. Now, many of these settlements are set upon land that is government land that has been given by the government to the Tibetans to live there in an understanding that it is theirs to use and to till they return. Some of this land is land that has been bought by some Tibetan organizations. So it is an outright purchase. Some of this land is gifted land. And when we talk about Tenzing settlement, we'll see that its land tenure is a gift. It's a gift deed. Okay. The other set of problems that the TRP is supposed to address is a problem of livelihood and employment. Now, increasingly over the 60s, 70s, 80s, especially in the last 15 years or so, there have been different facilitations given to Tibetans to allow them to have more livelihood opportunities. Now, we must keep in mind that we are today in India, we are seeing the third generations of Tibetans. So they are born in India, they grow up in India, they study in India, they largely live in India. So for a community to live as a community that has no rights or cannot make a livelihood, that would be a highly destabilized situation for any community. So over time, the government of India has provided certain facilitations where it's extended central and state government welfare services and development benefits to Tibetans, as well as access to jobs that they are qualified for. Okay, now, the TRP has till now been adopted by 4 states in India, and its implementation, especially with regard to land tenure, is underway in Karnataka, and it's still contentious in many other states, including Himachal. In Arunachal, as soon as the TRP is announced in 2014, local protests begin to happen. And in Arunachal, it's largely the politics of Arunachal, which I cannot go into great detail, but we'll discuss a little bit about it, is it's dominated by student groups, right? And you see a number of student groups, the oldest of them and the most politically significant of them, which is the AAPSU, All Arunachal Pradesh Students' Union, expresses displeasure against the TRP. There are newer student groups like the Students' Union Movement of All Arunachal, or SUMAA, that come up in the period between 2014 and 2017. And especially SUMAA focuses its energy in Borderlands and Tawang against the Tibetan presence there. Right now, Arunachal has had a long history of resistance to refugee settlement, and with good reason. For example, because Arunachal was not a state before 1987, and there was no legislative participation possible in the state. From 47 to 65, it was NEFA, which was administered directly by the Ministry of External Affairs. In 65, Ministry of Home Affairs takes over. Then in 72, Arunachal is made a union territory. It's only in 87 that Arunachal gets statehood. But all of the refugee resettlement, or the bulk of refugee resettlement in Arunachal happens before 87, right? So the argument given by the student groups there is that this was done without consultation with local stakeholders or getting local consent, which is largely not incorrect. Many of the refugee groups were settled there in the 60s. This is some of the history of the refugee migration to Arunachal. Chakmas and Hajongs, they migrate from East Pakistan to Tripura. And when there is local resistance in Tripura, then they are resettled in Nefa, which is Arunachal, erstwhile Nefa, in Lohit, Tarap, and Changlang districts. The Tibetans, most of them came either 59 or the bulk came after 62. They are mostly settled in West Kameng and Tawang. Now, in state level politics, the issue of Chakma, Hajong, and Tibetan refugees is often conflated to say, we don't want any refugee groups here. But there are differences, not just in their history of their migration, but what is their relationship with the Indian state as well. Okay. Now, in 1985, August 26, 1985, AAPSU passes a very important resolution. This is just preceding statehood, where it says Chakma, Hajongs, Tibetans, Yobins who are settled permanently in Arunachal should be moved under the Bengal East Frontier Regulation Act, or BEFRA. This is a colonial times act, which was basically a line that the British drew to demarcate the outer limits of the administrative setup of the colonial empire, right? And of course, it was conceived in fairly paternalistic terms, saying these are excluded areas, and these are areas in which people who live in the forests live, and they, the administrative setup was seen as something that was a civilizing mechanism. So under the BEFRA, the line it's not been a constant line. It has moved, but it largely separated areas of British influence, British administrative setup, from those that the British claimed as their part of their territory, but did not have an administrative footprint on the ground. Right now, what this resolution in 1985 did was raise the issue of rising population of refugee communities. And this was a response at that point into about the rising population of Chakmas, which also, of course, this is the period leading up to the Assam Accord as well, right? There was an influx at that point in time of internally displaced people from Assam to Arunachal. And refugee settlements were also seen as a long-term threat to territorial integrity of Arunachal as a border state. So the inner line permit regime that we see today, which is largely based on BEFRA of 1873, there was a demand to strengthen the ILP. Now, in many states in the Northeast, including Arunachal, I'm sure many of us know that you need an inner line permit to go visit the state. And you cannot you cannot live in Arunachal without an ILP, or you cannot run a business in Arunachal as an ILP. This is just a picture of my ILP when I had gone to Arunachal to do this work, right? Now, more recently, the AAPSU stand has been that they don't have a problem with Tibetan presence in Arunachal, but they object to granting of trade licenses to Tibetans on the ground that it violates BEFRA. How does it violate BEFRA? That unless you have an ILP, you cannot be living or trading in Arunachal. And because Tibetans refugees are not citizens, they are not eligible for ILP. So you cannot issue them trade licenses, right? Now, remember, these are people we are talking about, Tibetans in this region. We're talking about they've been there since 62, right? So they have set up businesses there. They have been formally settled by the state as well there, and they are living in scattered communities around the places where they have set up businesses. So what we're talking about is a highly interspersed community in the local regions, which is now having to prove its right to legitimately live and work there, right? Now, what was the impact on West Kameng and Tawang of the 2014 policies protests, right? So in March 2000, AAPSU says that it wants scattered populations of Tibetans in Borderlands and Tawang move to Tenzinggang, and their trade and business licenses examined. So in the entire decade of 2000, there is an increasing assertion by local groups to say that we don't have any problem with anybody living here, but they have to be living here on terms that are specified under national and state rules. So if under national and state rules, they are not supposed to be trading in this region because they don't have ILPs. we want their trade licenses examined. Now, here we must understand that Monyul, the region of Monyul, which is largely dominated by the Monpa Tibetan community or the Monpa community, they are followers of Tibetan Buddhism. Like I said before, the entire region of Monyul was actually both culturally as well as in terms of economics and socially oriented more towards Lhasa than south of the McMahon line. So there are kinship relations between the Monpas and the Tibetans. There are very frequent intermarriages. In fact, it seems odd to say they're very frequent intermarriages because it is just how it is. And Monpas are followers of Tibetan Buddhism. The monasteries in the region are largely Monpa monasteries. So there is a lot of overlap in the life in terms of its cultural and social realms. However, the formal status of Tibetans as refugees begins to actually bring about fractures in that, and that is largely related to issues of land and livelihood. So in 2000 the demand for, and in 2000 it's not the first time this demand is made. There have been, even before that, which I'll mention in a while, there have been campaigns run by student groups to drive Tibetans out of their scattered populations and into Tenzing Khan. In March 2000, when the demand by AAPSU is made to examine the business licenses, the allegation there is that anybody who's a Tibetan and has a business license has got it illegally. Now, it is also a fact that in a family, the husband might be Tibetan, but the wife might be Monpa. So the husband's doing a business on a trade license acquired by the wife. This kind of interspersed relationship between the community has increasingly come under scrutiny of the administration now, because there is a demand from local groups to actually distinguish between what is legal and what is not legal. Then there is an issue of ST certificates or the scheduled tribe certificates. The local groups, not just the Monpas, the others as well, they assert that many Tibetans, especially in West Kameng and Tawang, have acquired ST certificates illegally. There is again a very fluid relationship here between identity and proving citizenship here. For example, in 1962, the first lot of people who came with the Dalai Lama, it was a group of 90 families who came with the Dalai Lama. They were at that point actually given citizenship in India. So these people, this group of 90 families, and later on people who are their descendants, they are legally Indian. They're Tibetan, but they're legally Indian. Right? So ST certificate issue also gets a little, the waters get a little muddied, because you can't judge this only and only on the basis of the fact that this one is a Tibetan and that one is not a Tibetan. Right? Now in July 2017, Arunachal adopts the TRP, but there is immediate backlash against it, and the assembly is not able to actually move it forward. Right? In July 2018, the West Kameng DC constitutes a committee to verify ST certificates of the Tibetans in Borderlands town and in Tenzing Khan settlement. And this is on demand by the West Kameng District Students Union. And they give a list of demands to the district administration, saying if these demands are not met, we will take what they call direct action, by which what they mean is that they will go do a house-to-house search of residences as well as business premises and drive out those who are not legally present there. And on 13 July, SUMAA actually holds a rally in Borderlands town. This is a screen grab from the rally. And if I have time, I'll play this video for you once I'm done. Okay, and the rally in Borderlands is largely intended to intimidate Tibetan business owners as well as people who live in the town. So they target businesses with Tibetan names and signage. They heckle, they actually go and heckle certain people in the town who are Tibetans, who might be also married to Monpa people. And the situation turns fairly ugly. And the market remains shut for many days. And the SUMAA activists also drive into the settlement, which is about 50 kilometers away from Borderland town. And what the district administration does is they impose curfew, right? Now, the activists go and gherao the police station in Bondela, and they gherao the DC and the SP, and they say our demands should be met. So the situation there becomes fairly confrontational. And since that time, there has been a sense of unease amongst especially the people who live in Bondela town, the Tibetans, about what their future in this area is, where they have been living for many years. They also recall a time in the 1990s, early 1990s, where similarly Tibetans who were doing business in Kalaktang, which is a neighboring circle to Bondela in the district, in the West Kameng district, were driven away from there overnight and asked to go live in Tenzing Gang, which is the formal settlement. So the argument by the student groups is that if Tibetans have to live, they should live only and only inside the settlement. They should not live outside the settlement, right? Now, I think I just spoke about all this, that the SUMAA has already threatened that they will take direct action. They'll do a house-to-house search, and they demand a written undertaking from the Central Tibetan administration that the CTA will not claim Indian citizenship for Tibetans in Arunachal, or the ST certificates in Arunachal. Now, this is fairly unnecessary, because the CTA has a formal stand on Tibetans taking citizenship in India, which is we neither encourage nor discourage taking of citizenship in India. But in practice, it turns out that they do actively discourage people taking citizenship in India. They would like people who live as Tibetans in India to continue to be registered on what is called the registration certificate, which identifies them as Tibetan refugees, or because we don't have a formal category of refugees in India, it identifies them as foreigners, right? So all of this is going on, and this creates a situation of great precarity. Now let's talk about the land issue, okay, of Tenzing Gang. We spoke about the livelihood issue, now we'll talk about the land issue. Now this is a picture of the Tenzing Gang settlement, the main street over there, right? It began to attract Tibetan refugees since 1962. Now remember, Tawang, West Kameng, these are regions which are, like I said before, were part of Monyul. These are regions which Tibetans were not unfamiliar with. These are regions where they have major religious centers like the Tawang Monastery and other Dirang Monastery, and therefore it is a place where they would feel comfortable. So after 1962, there were a number of people who were settled by the Indian government in this place. Right? The beginnings of a settlement begins in 1968. Now, if you talk to the people, older people who were those part of the group that actually came down to put the settlement up, their experience tells us that this was forested land, which was not being used at that point in time. It was gifted by the by the village of Dumkho to his Dalai Lama, to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was about 2,100 acres of land was gifted to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because the people of Dumkho village and largely of the area are followers of Tibetan Buddhism. And this was a sympathetic gift deed that was given. This was also formalized with an arrangement between the community leaders, or Gaon Buddhas as they are known as in Arunachal, by different villages that were involved, and Tenzing Gang circle officer of Kalaktang and the DC of the district, right? Boundaries of the settlement were demarcated. And then the experience of the people who set up the settlement is that this was so heavily forested that they could literally go from tree to tree without actually having to come down and walk on the ground. And this is the land that they have cleared by hand. They didn't have proper implements. They initially made tools out of wood. Then when they got a little bit more money, they went to buy tools that would use axes and hacksaws. And they have cleared this out of the wood that they cleared. They set up houses. They pulled up trees, and this then made the land suitable for cultivation, right? Now, there's always been an ongoing dispute since the 80s between Tenzinggang and its neighboring villages of Lumdur and Shetang. Now, these land disputes are not specific or particular to Tenzingao. There are land disputes in Arunachal between villages as a matter of routine, right? But in the 1990s anti-refugee movement, this took on a kind of an inside-outside color, that these people are not Indians. These people are not supposed to be here. And these people are not on this land legally. Now, what has happened is that we see in the middle of the last decade, work began on the Trans-Arunachal Highway. And as you can see here, this is where it is going through West Kameng and then through the Sila Pass, which is a very strategic pass for India, to Tawang. Bondila is here and Tenzingao is very close to here. Once the BRO begins to acquire land for the highway, which is the NH13, land becomes very valuable, and claims on land begin to come in conflict between different people. So the people of Dongko village who had gifted this land to the Dalai Lama for his people to live there, the younger generation of the Dongko village begins to press its claims on the land of Tenzingao. Now, there is obviously a lot of change in the way people's relationship with land is organized, because in Arunachal, most of the land is community owned. Now I want to go back to that table which I showed you. This. So in West Kameng, 81% of the land is classified as rural. There is only one urban classification in all of West Kameng, that is Bomdila town, which is the district headquarters. In Tawang, 77% of the land is classified as rural, and only 22.4% is classified as urban. All of the land that falls in the rural category is community owned, which means you cannot have individual patas for that land. It has to be owned by the community. However, compensation when land acquisition happens is on individual basis. So this begins to actually fracture the land tenure relationships that have existed in Arunachal since hundreds of years. And Tenzingao is facing the effects of this changed relationship of the land of the locals with the land, right? So these are some of the arguments that have come up as an unintended consequences of land construction or road construction in the region. So these are some of the things that people from Dongko village are now beginning to say, that Tibetans were given better tracts of land in the beginning itself. But if you talk to the people who have set up the settlement and their experience, you do realize that this was land which was not being used by anybody at that point in time. Or they say the older people were foolish to give away this land. Or the thing that causes people in Tenzingao the most amount of anxiety, that is, gifted land is a loan rather than a donation, and it is tied to the lifespan of His Holiness and must be returned once His Holiness the Dalai Lama is no more. So this is what you begin to hear. And also, of course, arguments that Tibetans are favored by the government as refugees. And finally, tying it back to what we were talking in the first half, that Tibetans are not indigenous and they live illegitimately in and around Bomdila and run businesses. Okay. Now, there is on the ground organized assertions of identity, like the MMT. The MMT is the Monpa Mimang Sopa, which is the apex social body of the Monpas, who are the dominant population in Monyul. right? The MMT is now a registered society and it enjoys majority support as a representative organization of all Monpas, right? This is where I use the concept, which is a Freudian concept, which is called the narcissism of minor differences. This Freudian concept has been used in social theory by many scholars to explain everything from ethnic othering to ethnic conflict to genocide. That it is in among those groups where the differences are not that apparent that the most damaging and the most bitter conflicts actually emerge. So Monpas, as we've been talking, actually have a fairly close identification with Tibetan ways of life in terms of following Tibetan Buddhism, cultural values, religious organization for sure, and even in terms of economy, there's a history of the two communities interacting in economic sense, right? Of course, in that relationship, the Tibetans were always dominant because it was the Tibetan Empire, right? But now they are beginning to make assertions on cultural differences between the Tibetans and Monpas. So, for example, in Monpa-dominated areas today, there are government directives that on a Wednesday, everybody should wear Monpa clothes, regardless of whether you're Monpa or not. So everybody, regardless of whether you're from the region, not region, you do see, if you go out on a Wednesday in these regions, most of the people will make an attempt. If they're Monpa, they'll definitely make an attempt to be dressed in Monpa clothing. If they're not Monpa, then to show solidarity, they might actually be carrying some simple symbol of Monpa identity, right? Similarly, in monasteries, you can easily see they've always been Monpas and Tibetans living in the monasteries, but you begin to now see that this is being asserted as visible markers that set people apart, right? Now, then there are legal differences based on the date or period in which Tibetans have settled in Tawang and West Kameng. I mentioned before, there are 90 families settled in Tawang. These are families that came with the Dalai Lama in 1959, right? Then there are people of Shio village who came to Tawang when the Tawang monastery was built in 1683. So this is before 59. And the most voluble dissent is resistance is against people who came after 62. Now in 2022, which is last year, in the just few months back actually, the MMT passed a resolution that restricted property inheritance to the direct Monpa line. So, for example, if a Monpa woman has married a Tibetan man, which does happen fairly frequently, then only her female children will inherit her property. And that is also if only it is her own property, right? And they have also restricted buying and selling of property in Monyul only to the Monpa. I'm using buying and selling here, though you cannot legally buy or sell property, especially rural property in Arunachal. It has to be only gifted, right? But there is a selective deployment of aligning Monpa identity with the Tibetan identity. So what are the aligning factors? There is a movement to produce Monyul, which is Kalaktang, Dirang, Bomdila, and Tawang, as a dominantly Buddhist region. So there are other tribes present there, which are not Buddhist tribes. So there, the interests of the Tibetans and the Monpas actually coincide. Then there is Monpa attendance in Tibetan and monasteries and schools all through India. There is a large presence of Monpas in all monasteries and schools that are run by the Tibetan administration in most parts of India, right? Then Monpa Tibetan intermarriage is actually now being produced more and more as a patriarchal practice. So it's okay for Monpa man marries a Tibetan woman, but not the other way around. Then there are Tibetans who serve and who have died serving in the SFF, or which is known as the Tutu or the Vikas regiment. In fact, in Tenzing Gao, the primary job of the previous generation was to serve in the SFF. What are the disjunctures? The disjunctures are language is different, some customs are different, clothing-based identity assertions are becoming very, very visible, right? And you get to hear also some scattered references to Monpa Tibetan histories of exploitation, where the Tibetans were seen historically as exploiters. And finally, in legal terms, this is a divide between the people who are Indians and who are not Indians by citizenship, right? So when the interests are aligning, it serves both sides. For example, the Nishi tribe in these areas, the All Nishi Youth Association gave a statement in 2022 saying, because of Tawang, Arunachal is called Southern Tibet and befits to be called as Chinese. As TV channels, the people listen to South Tibet news. So the MMT said that this is something that we strongly object to. Now, it's not just the Monpa identity that they are in Tawang. It's not just the geographic location they're talking about. They're also talking about the religious identity of being Tibetan. So this is where it makes for closer relationship between the Monpas and the Tibetans. But there are clear fractures, and for any policy of building a robust borderland, I think state administrations and possibly policy needs to pay attention to this. Thank you.
Thanks. I was a little worried whether we have overshot, but I didn't want to break. You were going at a fairly good clip, so I didn't want to break that flow. Thanks, Sonika, for helping us understand some of these, the bordering and othering discourses that are at play. So I have a couple of questions, but I wonder whether I should wait a bit and first get some interventions and questions from the audience. So let me see if there are any in the chat box.
Hi, Sonika.
I think there's a comment by...
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi. So, Nimi, I would really request you to kickstart the discussion, and please,
Sure.
Because the idea of bringing you here was precisely to.
That's great, Alka. I'm delighted if I can jump in, because I was trying to hold myself back because I thought I should not, kind of abuse the role and kind of hog. Okay, great. Let me, while all of you kind of think through some of these and process these, couple of quick thoughts, Sonika. So I think we really need to see vulnerability in relational terms, really, because and to recognize that there are hierarchies of vulnerabilities and exclusions. And even, it might sound bizarre, but even there would be some who are privileged among those who are vulnerable. So a very quick example, just as an illustrative example, would be, let's say, just to take to borrow from the Afghan, let's say, Afghan refugee, a Hazara would be far more vulnerable than a Tajik. A Hazara uneducated woman would be far more, vulnerable than a Tajik male or a Hazara male. So, the point is that there are vulnerabilities and intersectionalities here that we need to be mindful of. So my question really is, if we use the intersectional lens, how would one evaluate the TRP? Does the TRP tend to homogenize the Tibetan experience, or does it acknowledge some of these diverse categories of vulnerabilities?
Okay, that's a great question. I wish there had been that much reflection while the TRP was actually codified. So it is a fairly homogenizing instrument. And it was actually in response to a land dispute that's going on currently. It's been going on for a while now in Dharamshala, in McLeodganj, right?
Yes.
And there's a group of families in McLeodganj who are settled on forest land. Tibetan families who are settled on forest land. And the forest department had given them eviction notices. And this is what kind of set the ball rolling for discussions between the CTA and the Home Ministry about what to do about similar issues. Now, because the Tibetan issue is a national policy issue, they kind of devised a overarching policy, which every state where there are Tibetan settlements state governments have to individually adopt. Right? So that's why you see a very, very wide variation in what is the status of the implementation of the TRP. So it's been adopted only in 4 states. The most successful implementation is in Karnataka, especially with regard to land tenure. And there's a reason for that. Most of the settlements in Karnataka are on land formally leased by the state government to the CTA.
Like including Bailakuppe?
Including Bailakuppe. Right? So, but if you look at Tenzingam, it's a gift deed. Right? So there is no paperwork beyond saying it's a gift deed, how long people will be there, what is the duration of the gift deed, whether, so this was based on good faith, that this was a compassionate gesture by the people, by the Monpas of Dumku village, that we recognize that this is a moment of crisis and people need help. Right? Now, how do state governments actually respond to this? Most of the time, what the state governments do, which is actually in a way facilitating for the Tibetans, is they just kick it upstairs. They say this is a national policy issue. Let us get a directive from the top. Now, if you get a directive from the top, it is a directive which is always accompanied by these are guidelines. You implement it within your own context as applicable. Right? So in Himachal, this is happening. There's a long-standing dispute about this, settlement of these refugee families on forest land. But they are not the only people settled on forest land. There are locals who are living on forest land. Right? So if they formally allow the Tibetan families to continue to live there, they are living there, but they formally allow them, then they have to allow Indian citizens as well. Right? So what you mentioned about, this vulnerability is, it's not something that you understand in terms of the dominated and the dominant. It is what at some point in time almost becomes oppression Olympics. Who is more oppressed? Right? And there are rightful claims from both sides. People who are born in India, have lived all their life in India, have died in India, and their children are now living in India. Are their rights on what they have created as their land where they are living, with the land which they have made cultivable? Do they not have rights to it? Formally, the CTA has never claimed that any land should be formally handed over forever to the CTA or to the Tibetans. It's always in the shape of a lease till they return. It's always there in the lease till they return to Tibet.
Thanks. Thanks, Sonika. So I have a related question. So I think much of what you said, I think resonates with the point that I made, that this vulnerabilities and marginalization is essentially a relational, category, a relational, we have to see it in relational terms. So you also mentioned something that stood out for me, which is a fairly obvious, statistics. You mentioned that the Tibetan refugee presence is a tiny minority. So I was wondering if I could push that idea of the minority a bit to look at minorities within minorities,
Absolutely.
such as the Bonpo. So how marginalized are they? Within Tibetan identity discourses. So if we were to, looking in from the outside, you've explained that very well. Now, if we were to turn the gaze inward to look at the Tibetan identity discourses itself, to look at further minorities within this minority, the reason I say this is because from my own study of Burma's identity discourses, there's a very interesting study by Michael Walton, where he shows how the idea of unity, for instance, gets leveraged as what he calls a disciplining tool to invisibilize a range of identities and actors. So do you see some of these at play? And is there what I would say characterize as is there some sort of a moral rejection of dissent? Because there is a compulsion to construct a unified voice.
I think you've answered your own question. Yes.
Okay.
You have pretty much answered your own question. So, but to historically contextualize this, when in 59, the Dalai Lama and people who came with him came to India, they had two main, challenges in front of them. First was how to survive, right? And that out of that concern emerges the Indian Tibetan Rehabilitation, the entire program for Indian Tibetan Rehabilitation, right? Now, how that program should be organized was the second challenge, because it had to actually work towards creating a national, a unified national body of the nation in exile, right? Now, this body of the nation could not be at that point in time conceived of as divided into the Geluk and the Kagyu and the Sakya and the Nima and the Bompo, right? Though in terms of where they came from in Tibet, there wasn't that much interaction between between people who lived in different valleys, who came from different places, and they all ended up coming here and living together. Right. So there was in fact, it's articulated by the Dalai Lama himself that we have to build now a more unified Tibet than we were practicing back in Tibet. Not that was a requirement in Tibet at that point in time, right? But it became a historical necessity in exile. And some of these categories have become over time in exile fairly discriminatory categories. And it completely underlies Tibetan exile politics, the democratization of their polity in exile, and it's a serious issue that everybody, including the Dalai Lama, has spoken about. So it's not as if Tibetans who are living in exile are some kind of they're living in some kind of pure unity of the Tibetan nation. There are things that do divide people, but the Dalai Lama himself is the most unifying symbol, right? Having said that, I would also contextualize this by saying, but this is not a particularly Tibetan condition.
That's true. Absolutely.
So there are sometimes, inquiry, academic inquiry also in this regard, sometimes tends to essentialize the Tibetan experience as, all Tibetans are good Buddhists, all Tibetans are non-violent, all Tibetans love, the kind of dominant projection of the Tibetan Buddhist identity, and expect that there will be some kind of a pure response from the Tibetan community to very everyday problems that everybody else in the world is also facing, right? So I do feel that this expectation that why is there no unity amongst people, or why are there problems in building the kind of purified unity amongst people of fighting for their own nation, I feel this is fairly essentialized inquiry at times.
No, but that may be so. I don't deny that. But my point was slightly different. And again, borrowing from the Burmese, I see uncanny, similarities. The point is that precisely because there are differences, there is an attempt to use unity as a disciplining tool.
True. Agree.
So I don't say that.
Yeah. And in fact, that serves very well when you come up with problems like the kind of problem that is there in Arunachal, that what is presented as a Tibetan identity is then from the CTS side is essentialized to say this is Tibetan.
Exactly.
And they want to engage largely with the dominant, the Gelok, the middle way approach, the Buddhist part of it, and all of that. Right?
Yes.
Of course, absolutely, that is there.
Yes.
One cannot
yes.
shut.
Yeah, thanks. So, Sonika, we have a couple of comments and a question. So we have a comment from Colonel Verma.
I just take these? I can see them. So can I just...
Great. Go ahead.
So Colonel Sahai, who's my parents' neighbor, incidentally in Delhi, and I
Okay.
call him Verma uncle. So there is a comment by Verma uncle saying that some payment is made by Tawang monastery to parent monastery in Tibet, not to the Lhasa government. Well, what I mentioned about taxation that the Lhasa government, that went to the Lhasa government, was not necessarily from the Tawang monastery, but from the zones, from the Takluk zone and the Dirang zone that was set up as tax collection points from the Munkas. Okay, so I hope that clarifies that point. And there is a question about, is there any data on Tibetans who had migrated and settled in Tawang and West Kameng prior to 1959? I don't know if there is any data in terms of an actual continuing census, because this is what we're talking about is 1683. The Tibetans who came, so Shio Basti is a place which is identified with Tibetans living in Tawang, who were related initially to the construction and then the upkeep and management of the Tawang monastery. So these were Tibetans who came in 1680 and have continued since to live there, right? Shio Basti also is historically located in relation to the Tawang monastery as the people who were largely there because the Tawang monastery needed Tibetans from Tibet, from the northern part, to come and to put things in, get the ball rolling in the Tawang monastery. So as of now, there is the MMT. If you ask the MMT, they say we have an identification of the 90 families who have come with the Dalai Lama. But before that, the people in the Shio Basti, not necessarily, right? Then Dr. Rappai has a comment that Dalai Lama may be unifying identity, but there are different sects within their own identities and customs. Yeah, Nimi and I spoke about this. So relating to today's topic, I wonder if there's any potential implication to India-China border disputes. Well, I think so, because this is an area that's claimed, Tawang is an area, and all of Tawang is a sensitive area claimed by China, as well as all of Arunachal is claimed by them. And we have to pay attention, I would say, to the local disaffections on the ground in India when it's engaged in its state-making efforts along this border. So whether it has an impact on the negotiations between India and China, I think that's a separate question. But I think to pay attention to what is happening on the ground is essential for the Indian government. Then Pempasaring, is there any possibility of His Holiness the Karmapa to visit the monastery? I think this is a question that the Ministry of Home Affairs should answer, not me. Yes, in room tech. I don't think I can answer this question, but all I can say is that the Indian government has made a fair mess of the Karmapa's presence in India, and I don't know when he's likely to return. You have discussed how local identity politics and nature of land and NH13 highway construction as important factors shaping the anti-refugee politics in Monyul. I was wondering how this plays out in other Tibetan settlements in Arunachal, Miao and Tezu. Thanks, Rija, for that question. Once I visit those places, I'll let you know. I haven't yet had the opportunity to visit Miao or Tezu. It's on the cards, but Arunachal is not an easy place to travel in. So, and just about started traveling after the pandemic last year. So we could only cover the western part. Yeah. Anyone else? I think I've covered all the comments. Is there anyone whose comment I might have missed out?
Yes, I think from there are 3 more, I think.
3 more? Okay.
Oh, 1 more.
Oh, Ambassador Kantha, do you have any policy recommendations on handling these differences? Well, I think one of the things that will work very well on the ground is to actually conclude a lease of the Tenzing settlement with the government of India, which is what the problem in that is that the people in the settlement want a formal lease concluded, but the people in the Borderland town, the Tibetans in the Borderland town, fear of backlash if that happens, and they are concerned that they will not be they will not be able to bear the backlash of the locals to that. But as this is a national level policy, I think the state government, the central government should throw its weight behind it and ensure that its policy is implemented with the least amount of disruption in sensitive areas like Tenzing. And also to keep in mind, we have instances of the army chief going and visiting 2 brigades along the border, right? Remember, many of the soldiers, they come from these settlements. So this is something to keep in mind, I would say, right? So then there's a question from Fasalka, the question from Japan. I did answer that, ma'am, about does it have any impact on India-China relations? I think that was the question.
Oh, okay. I may have missed it either. I thought it wasn't.
Pempasering says, you had mentioned that every land owned by Tibetans is on lease. So what about who has Indian citizenship and also holds some land in India, such as Clementown, which is in Dehradun? I'm not familiar with the land tenure arrangements in Clementown, but any Tibetan who is on RC cannot buy land in India. So if you are an Indian citizen, you can buy land. And there are many Tibetans who have over time, and this is not a very large number, but there are many who have Indian citizenship and can buy land in India. There are many who might be married to Indians who are Tibetan refugees, and through that they can get land in India. But there is an obscure RBI guideline that you can get permission from the RBI to buy land. But that process, I have never heard in all these years that I've been talking to people from the settlements, nobody's even aware of this. And I think if anybody's gone through this, it's just so cumbersome. It's intended as a discouraging mechanism rather than a facilitating one. In terms of the settlements, there are 3 types of broad land tenure arrangements that exist. One is like the one in Bailakuppe and other agricultural settlements in Karnataka, which is land is leased directly by the government to the CTA. The second is land is purchased by Tibetan societies, registered societies. So for example, the Bonpo society in Simla, it's actually established on that land. And the third is Majnu Katila type of, or, which is land that is tacitly given for. The fourth kind is, of course, the gift deed, which is fairly rare, but these are the 4 types of land arrangements. I don't know exactly what Clementown's land tenure arrangement is. Yeah. I'm from Japan. In 2008, Dalai Lama stated for the first time that Tawang is Indian territory. Why in 2008 he made such a statement? Okay. Why is the statement significant? Why would you say the statement is significant? I mean, Arunachal becomes a state. It's a union territory and then becomes a state of India in 1987, right? Do you think it actually strengthens Indian claim over Arunachal to have the Dalai Lama say that it is Indian territory? I think the value of that assertion in an India-China dispute is not very, very high. It can be a signaling, at the most, it can be a signaling exercise. If you take a not so kind view of it, it can be, a strategy to irritate the other side. But in terms of claims on the ground, the Tibetans are not there anywhere in the negotiations on this. So the Dalai Lama's statement, what value does it have, and what response should there be a policy response to it is what I would say. What is the Tibetan, Captain Kiran Khankhoje, what is the sentiment of the Tibetans to regain their homeland? I'm assuming it is not homepage. Well, I think they are very conscious of the fact that they are a community that have that are living away from their homeland forcibly, and they are in exile. And I don't think I have met any Tibetan who considers this issue of going back to Tibet or reclaiming their homeland as irrelevant to their lives. How they want to do it, what is their broad commitment, what do they agree on is a good strategy, might be different things. But I don't think I've come across anybody who thinks that this issue is irrelevant to their lives, because it is not. Everybody who's living outside of Tibet is living either as a refugee or as a person who's living in another country away from what your rightful place is. I think Okay. I think I have addressed most of the questions, all of the questions actually. Yeah. Is there anything left that I could address? Oh, one more new message. Let's take a look. But there's no consolidated movement. From the outside, if one is looking for an evidence of the movement in the news, you could say there is no consolidated movement. But if you know of all of the effort that the Tibetans put in keeping the Tibet issue alive, despite negligible international support to their movement, you could say it is a failure of the international community that we are not aware of how much effort the Tibetans are putting into keeping their movement alive. What is the nature of that movement right now? What are the successes of that movement? It is quite dependent on how much support the international community is willing to give them. So during the Trump years, there was a window of opportunity that opened when the United States passed the Tibet Policy Support Act, in which they clearly stated that the issue of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama is an issue only of the Tibetans and nobody else should interfere in that. Because we know as soon as there is, the passing away of the current Dalai Lama, the Tibetans, the Chinese are most likely going to announce their own Dalai Lama, like they did with the Panchen Lama, right? The United States has stepped up and actually passed a bill in their legislature saying that the reincarnation should not be a concern of anybody else except the Tibetans. But I don't think there is much more broader international support coalescing around that. But the TPSA has come about because the Tibetans have consistently raised the Tibet issue in the US Congress, right? But it has got attention only when it suits the American foreign policy interests vis-a-vis China.
So just to add on to what you said about this, just a one-line comment on the question by Captain Khankoje about there's no consolidated movement. Mm-hmm. I would also, to me that sounds like a little simplistic to assume that that there could be to frame it as a consolidated movement, because the Tibetan identity itself is not consolidated or unified. Pretty much what we have discussed today, if there's any one single takeaway for me is that there is a multiplicity and a hybridity and of the Tibetan identity, and how it's morphing and getting at times strengthened, at times getting splintered. So it'll be very simplistic to assume that there could be a consolidated identity or a movement. So the two would go together. We have a question from Anand and also another in the chat box. Anand, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gupta, and thank you, Dr. Kurian. My couple of questions. In fact, one was, something which you just answered in the previous question, but I just wanted to build on that too. So all these issues you're talking about, especially with regard to a settled population or refugee population vis-a-vis the local population. So how is this all going to play out post the transition of the Dalai Lama? How is the new person who is going to come, or the reincarnation, or however it's going to play out, how is it going to all these questions too of which because Tibetan politics or Tibetan society, the Dalai Lama continues to hold center stage in many levels. So how is that going to play out? Because I was quite interested in one of those queries by the local population, which was saying that this is actually a gift to the Dalai Lama. So once he's done, it has to be kind of returned. But the question is also whether it is this Dalai Lama, or if there is an institution post or his successor, then what kind of that happens. The second is more in terms of...
Anand, can I just take this first and then you can...
Yeah.
Because it's a longish question. So there is a huge amount of concern in the Tibetan community about what will happen to the Tibetan exile population as a whole once the 14th Dalai Lama passes away. And this kind of concern is not just with regard to what will happen with them in terms of where they're living or whatever. I mean, it is a much more, it's a deeper crisis of identity itself. It's a deeper crisis of faith itself, right? But specifically related to the issue of Tenzing Gang, the people of Dumko will just said that this is a gift to the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama that we gave. Now we want for his lifespan. So we want the land to revert. And this has caused a whole lot of precarity amongst people. And as you can, once you go there, you see that the settlement is hollowing out. And this is not, of course, only a particular this thing of that settlement, characteristic of that settlement. Tibetan settlements in India are generally hollowing out. Right. Because younger people are getting better educated, they're getting better jobs, many of them are moving abroad to study. So there is a general hollowing out of Tibetan settlements in India, and that is a very major concern for the CTA. That the Tibetan community, which was living in some amount of the cohesive structures in India, is now spread all across the world. Right? So one of the purposes of these settlements was to preserve Tibetan culture, Tibetan language, Tibetan Buddhism. So the concerns of the CTA are along those lines as well. Right? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. No, I was actually interested in because especially in questions around frontier regions, what has happened. But anyway, you answered the larger
on
point.
The frontier region, it becomes even more, see, around the frontier region, I feel that it can be instrumentalized more.
Okay.
That because this is going to affect everybody who lives in the Tibetan settlement.
Right.
The passing away of the Dalai Lama is going to affect all of them, right? Now, because Tenzing Gang happens to be in a border region,
right,
it can be instrumentalized by the people who have a local resistance towards Tibetan presence.
Right.
So, Sonika, we have a question from Ravi.
Yeah, sorry,
okay.
Yeah, just, I mean, my other point is more general in the sense that this is the xenophobia is, I mean, it's also the region which is there. I mean, it has a long legacy, especially in India's Northeast, which kind of different contestations are running and very intricately intertwined. So the question is also about, of course, this is something which is at least in public perception or what is disseminated in popular media, is that the other identities or other questions run far greater, especially foreigners and other thing in Assam, for instance. So do these xenophobic urges or these what is visible as what's reflected in your fieldwork, do they still have the capability of getting the groundswell similar a la what the Assam Accord and that entire politics, what surrounds that, or even some of the other things in other parts of the Northeast? Does this have this capability of gaining their groundswell in the times to come?
If I understand your question correctly, you're talking about whether the exclusionary assertions of identity are going to get stronger.
Right.
I think they are being increasingly accommodated by the state.
Right.
And increasingly appropriated by the state. So from that, we can assess whether they are likely to get more assertive when there is a state in power that is capable of, or that is not capable of, that is willing to actually accommodate these, especially in the legislative arena. So, for example, currently what I mentioned, the MMT, which is a social organization, wants everybody to dress a particular way on Wednesdays, which is the day of the Tibetan Buddhists.
Right.
Now, directives are beginning to come down from government offices that you must dress like this. So when the state is co-opting this and the state sees the organizational potential in this, and it's not just in Arunachal, like you pointed out, it is there everywhere. So the Monpa autonomy movement fizzled out, but there has been a demand for producing the Monyul region as a largely Tibetan Buddhist Monpa dominated area that exists on the ground. MMT actually represents that.
Right. No, I was bringing the Assam thing because there is also the strong religious angle to it. So, I mean, all the outsiders are largely, I mean, there's a religious
Tibetan
ascribing.
Buddhist as the category of religion.
Right. Okay.
There's
No,
one question from, I think, from KG Ide. Do you think the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama might realistically place in Tawang? If I could answer that question, I think I'd make a lot of money. But this is a question that I think is causing sleepless nights to many countries in the world, including India, right? What I can share with you here is probably what you already know. The Dalai Lama said he will not reincarnate in occupied Tibet. He might not reincarnate at all. Or he might identify as incarnation during his lifetime. Now, given these are possibilities, Tawang is a region which is very close to India. It has a very important monastery. The 6th Dalai Lama was born in Tawang. These are the reasons why people would say that Tawang is a strong contender, right? But there are other places which are also equally strong contenders. So that's how I would answer this question. Anyone else?
Yeah, we have a question from Rappai, Sonika. Rappai, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nimi. Actually, it is not a full question, but this is in continuation to what about the reincarnation. But the reincarnation is a complicated issue. It is not only what US passed the laws or the resolutions, but as of now, to find out the reincarnated child, almost all the cards are within the Tibet, because that urn is with the Tibet. The person who to train Panjan Lama is in Tibet. So I think in the religious context, religious tradition, it will be a complicated problem, and I don't know how the generations after Dalai Lama is going to settle it. As Sonika correctly pointed out, the refugees, most of them have found out better avenues. They are better educated. So I don't know how many of them will come back. And, of course, this Dalai Lama is still going to be a religious symbol and a sensitive issue for most of the Buddhists. But if we look at other groups, how they are going to react, we have to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rappai. Nice to hear you after so many years. I would just make one clarification. The golden urn. There is no written rule that the golden urn will be used. It was used.
I understand that. But the thing is, if you look at the cards, that is with the Tibet, the monasteries, the train, all are in the Lhasa and around that. That is the only art.
Well, the biggest card himself is the 14th Dalai Lama, who is not in Tibet.
Yeah, but of course, his statements, you mentioned it. That's why I didn't go back to that. But that itself is complicated.
Right.
I think we are pretty much done. I don't see any more questions. Are there any? Oh, yeah, Alka, please go ahead.
I just waited till the end because mine was not such a deeply into the subject kind of question, and so I waited till the more serious ones would go. So I have a very just a kind of a curiosity about the fact that would there be any engagements or interactions between these communities, and how much do they travel to Tibet, for instance? Are there any sort of statistics about whether they go there? What are the nature of their engagement? Is it just a trip to the ancestral land? Are there other linkages? So in other words, what would be the nature of the linkages between these communities here and within Tibet?
So till 1990s, it was possible to go to Tibet and come back. But now it is not possible to go to Tibet. There are many people who came in the 1990s as little children because their parents from Tibet sent them to India to study in Tibetan schools here. Because that's the time you begin to see a tightening of the Chinese state on schools in Tibet, right? So many people actually came in the 1990s to study in India. And I think many of them expected that they will be able to go back. A few were able to go back and come back. But many of them, if you meet them, after they've come to India, they've never met their families before. Right now, it's just not possible to go. And in fact, it has become also very dangerous now to keep in touch with family back in Tibet, because the families are all being monitored. And as repression increases in Tibet, even the fact that you have a family member living in exile, especially in India or in Nepal, can become a political liability for those back in Tibet. So
yeah, Sonika, the Nepal group is a large group. I think even we don't have all the information about that.
True.
The people who stuck there.
Absolutely. And they're in a very bad condition. I mean, the Tibetans who are in India at least have the state's resettlement programs facilitations. The Tibetans in Nepal have, I mean, the ones who did not come earlier, many who came earlier are doing very well. They've set up very flourishing businesses. But the ones who came later, when Chinese influence began to work on Nepal, they are in a very sad state of affairs.
Yeah, that is post 95, I am talking.
Post 95, and increasingly now again. Yeah.
So which means that they, even if they apply and go through proper procedures, they are not permitted to go back. I mean, to just for a visit.
For example, the Dalai Lama holds Kalchakra teachings in India every 4 years, right?
Yeah.
And many people do want to come. During the last Kalchakra that happened, it is reported that passports of the Tibetans were confiscated so that they would not. So many of them were trying to come to India by applying for a visa to Thailand. So they would first go to Thailand, and then they would apply for an Indian visa in Thailand and then come for the Kalchakra here. People in Tibet were reporting that their passports are systematically being taken away so that they cannot travel to India. So there's a huge amount of restriction on people traveling to India, and it is very dangerous. I mean, there are also at the same time stories of people who've gone back and resettled back in Tibet, right? After having spent maybe 10, 15 years in India. But there are no statistics that I have come across, or anybody has told me that there might be possible to get statistics of how many people have gone back. There are people who've gone back, but I don't know how large that number is. It looks like it's a fairly minuscule number as compared to people who come to India and then migrate to other parts of the world. It is possible to go back to Tibet if you have migrated from Tibet to, say, United States or to Europe. And if you have citizenship, but people from India find it very difficult to go back. People from Australia find it very difficult to go back because formal Australian policy is to give asylum to former political prisoners in Tibet. So these people are already persona non grata in Tibet, and their families are being very closely watched.
Oh dear, this is only likely to get worse, I think, as we, Thanks a lot. That was very interesting.
Thank you for that question, ma'am.
So, Professor Oberoi, would you like to come in, or is ma'am there?
Yes, simply to say this has been a fascinating encounter one way and another, and all the questions very relevant and much appreciated. And I think much left to think about as we go forward. I was only going to say that in parts of Yunnan province, where there are big Tibetans, big settlements or groups of Tibetan descent, I was very surprised to find that people in the 90s and early 2000s onwards had actually been coming down to India and being educated here, getting back. But clearly, and they were punished for it. There's no doubt about that, and had been during the Cultural Revolution very badly earlier. But it really amazed me that there was so much traffic of young people getting educated, going to and fro, and a lot of silence. But I think that's a story of the past.
Thank you for that comment, Professor Oberoi. I'd just like to add to that. It has been easier right from the beginning from people outside of the TAR, especially Yunnan and Sichuan, to come to India. TAR is the most heavily repressed in terms of travel to India, to and fro travel to India.
I'm not surprised about that. It was just a surprise that people from other parts of China were really able to get to India, to be educated here, to go to schools here, and very reverential towards the Dalai Lama as
Absolutely.
well. I mean, it was a very strong feeling of people I talked to. Absolutely, but that is well and truly, I guess, a thing of the past.
It was also part of the policy in the 1990s in China of good neighborliness.
Mm-hmm.
So, both sides were expecting this, that this is something we will look upon as something we have together facilitated for Tibetans to travel to India and back from places like Sichuan and Yunnan.
Mm.
But for the TAR, it has always been much more difficult.
So I think there are no more questions. Let us, I think we could wrap this up. Let me now take a minute to thank you, Sonika, and a very engaged audience for a great set of questions. I think just to wrap up, I think a couple of things really stood out for me as I listened to all of you. I think implicit in much of what we discussed today is the notion of the quote unquote good refugee. And we see this, you mentioned in passing, Sonika, that and I absolutely agree with you that the Chakmas, Hajongs, and Tibetans are often conflated. But when you look at the Arunachali bordering and othering discourses today, especially right at the top, you see the chief minister, the way he's been framing the issue. Tibet, he is kind of using, creating this narrative of the Tibetans as essentially the good refugee versus Chakmas and Hajongs as constituting a law and order problem.
Yeah.
So that is also something that is, being created. Sorry?
You will be up and about. Just relax. So you've got to.
So I think that is really a cause for concern, because that's the kind of binaries that we are beginning to see. And at the end of the day, what it really made me think is that all of us, i.e. the academy and the knowledge that we produce, has to be mindful of the fact that the marginalized are often powerless to hide from the research gaze. And the power to frame is really also the power to distort. And really, it reminded me of Judith Butler's poignant questions. Which life, when is life grievable? And this is from her, research on board, but there, I extrapolated here to ask, a slightly modified version of what her question is: when is life grievable, or which lives are grievable? There are some lives that are grievable and some are not. So this is really sits at the intersection of memory and politics, and it's really has echoes with many of the questions that we discussed today. I think I'll stop there. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, we would like to conclude this session by thanking the panelists, Professor Nimi Kurian and Professor Sonika Gupta, for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. We would like to welcome everyone for our next Wednesday seminar, which is a roundtable panel discussion on China-US relations. Down balloon, cancel visit, is it a lost opportunity? Information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could also subscribe to